Welcome everyone. This week's lecture is about access and egress, and this will relate directly to assignment 2. So this is the image that I showed you in my last online lecture, which you can see seating in the MCG northern stand in the top image and the MCG southern stand in the bottom image. So what we're going to do in this lecture is go through the legislation and guidelines to see how the egress and access requirements for these kinds of stadium seating are calculated and regulated. So really what we need to do is to design a grandstand for which every seat conforms to a set of design criteria that for which a building approval can be achieved. The documents we'll be looking at will be these two today. So on the one on the left, it's the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds, which is also called the Green Guide. And this is an international document which I've spoken about before and is on the Canvas site, a copy of which is on the Canvas site. And also we'll be looking at the National Construction Code, which is also known as the Building Code of Australia, the BCA. So let's start with the BCA, or the National Construction Code. You can see that both names are actually here on the cover. So the NCC and the BCA, those acronyms are interchangeable. As I might have mentioned before, the National Construction Code is available for a free download, although you do have to register for the free download. The National Construction Code has 4 volumes, an introductory guide to the code, Volume 1, which is about Class 2 to 9 buildings, Volume 2, which is about Class 1 and Class 10 buildings, and Volume 3, which is about plumbing. So note that I've spoken about classes of buildings according to the code. Stadiums are a Class 9B building, and so this is what we'll be referring to in the code itself. So before we get into the section on access and egress, let's go through some definitions. Starting from the top, accessible is important here because I've asked for universal access into the stadium. Our stadium is an assembly building, as you can see there from under assembly building, clause C3, sports stadium, sporting club, etc. is considered an assembly building. The next two are deemed to satisfy provisions, and deemed to satisfy solutions. So deemed to satisfy really means that what a designer is proposing is as listed in the code itself. Alright, so it's very prescriptive, and just as long as you conform to that prescription, then you are deemed to have satisfied, which would then allow the building certifier to give you approval for that. Exits are important to us. Please note here that exits include things like internal and external stairways, ramps, fire isolated passageways, and so on and so forth. So if you go into the NCC, you can see that all the text in blue there are hot linked to the definitions page. So as you're going through the bits that you're required to, you can always click on the hot link to take you to the definitions of that particular term. Horizontal exits over there, which means 2 parts of the building separated by a firewall, and there'll be a bit more about that later. But I would also like to point out what performance solution means in this case. So we generally go for performance solutions when as of right or deemed to satisfy deemed to satisfy provision, as you can see over here, does when our building is not able, or our design is not able to conform to a deemed to satisfy requirement. So it means that we need to go for a performance solution where the performance requirements are fulfilled without following a deemed to satisfy solution. Sole occupancy unit, I've just put that there because that refers to a series of rooms within our building. So if you look at C there, it's a room or suite of associated rooms in a Class 9 building. Again, we are not covered by D because that's 9C, whereas we are 9B. Stage is actually the floor platform in the Class 9B building. So in our case, it will be where the netball court actually is. The NCC also allows for local building legislation, but to contain the scope of assignment 2, we won't be looking at the local ACT building regulations. If you really want to, that's fine, but I expect you to fulfill the requirements of the general code before you actually go and have a look at this. And just to reiterate, it's not necessary for you to look at this, and I'll be looking at how you respond to section D of the code and the other sections of the code before we go to the local ACT rules. So going to section D, which is about access and egress, that is actually divided into 2 parts. I'll take you through a few of the things which are relevant, but you also need to look at it closely yourselves and apply it to your assignments. So, section D is laid out in 2 parts. Firstly, the performance requirements, and then following that will be everything in a little bit more prescriptive detail. So performance requirements are pretty general, as you can see from DP1 over here, which relates to us. This is a few more of the performance requirements that relate to us in terms of exits, fire isolated exits, path of travel to exits. And really, for every one of these clauses, there will be associated detail following. And of course, for us, we'll be interested in things like travel distances under exits, the number of occupants, the use of the building, which I've already spoken about, and in terms of fire isolated exits, how our 9B building will have to respond to this. And then paths of travel of exits is also something that needs to be designed. Evacuation lifts may be required if you don't want to put in a whole stack of ramps, because what we need to do here is to be able to get we are making provision for people in wheelchairs to use the stadium, so we'll also have to find ways of getting them out of the building should there be an emergency. DV3 is the last of this part, which is really about ramps, and you can see there that the ramp is to have a gradient no steeper than 1.8. Where I've cut notes off, like as you can see here with DV3 part A1, it basically means that the next bits are not really relevant to what we're looking at, but please have a look at it to satisfy yourselves. So the second part of section D is really the the deemed to satisfy provisions, which is where we go through in greater detail and in more prescriptive detail what is actually required by the NCC. So you can see here in clause D 1.0 that there are additional requirements for class 9B buildings, which is our stadium buildings, in part H1. So if we go to part H1, what we will see here is what H1 actually says. Okay, so the main thing that we have to look at here is that is that it actually talks about in clause A1, a line of nosings of consecutive steps that does not exceed an angle of 30 degrees to the horizontal. So this is basically the angle, the maximum angle of your seating tiers. And then it also talks about the height of each tier not to be more than 600 millimeters, and I don't think any of you have anything more than 600 millimeters at the moment. And then the other interesting thing here is in terms of clause C, clause C1 and C2, which is really talking about the distance between the front of the seats in a row and the backs of the seats in front in the next row down. So what this means is that it's got a requirement here. If you have rows of seats that are 3.5 meters long with exits to both sides, then your clearance can be 300 millimeters, and if the distance to and out from a seat is more than 3.5 meters, then you need to have 500 mil worth of clearance. And we will go through this a little bit more when we get to the green guide. The green guide also has suggestions, but for the purposes of this assignment, we'll be using this clause C1 and C2. So going back to section D, access and egress, really what we need to do is to look at quite a few of these clauses. I will point you to the number of exits required. So every building must have at least one exit from each story. And then class 9 buildings need to have 2 extra exits, and there's a whole stack of other requirements over there that you have to look at to see if it actually relates to you or not. It talks a bit here about open spectator stands, and please note that ours is not an open spectator stand because it has a roof over it. So this open spectator stand requirements don't actually relate to assignment 2. If this is important because they are talking about stairs here, and if it is an open spectator stand, we don't need it to be a fire rated stair. So what we need here is, because we do not have an open spectator stand, we need a performance solution to overcome the need. This is probably the most interesting thing here, and this is something that you will have to calculate. So in the assignment, I've asked you to calculate the travel distances, exit travel distances for the back of house only, and not for the front of house. That's because I think that the front of house will be pretty easy to achieve in our case. So if you can see clause E over there, the travel distance to an exit of a 9B building must not be more than 60 meters in an open spectator stand. The complication being that we are roofed, so we can't use this one. So really, if we go through this, what it says is that no point on the floor must be more than 20 meters from an exit, or a point from which travel in 2 different directions, or in different directions to 2 exits is available, in which case the maximum distance to one of those exits must not exceed 40 meters. Okay, so that relates to class 9 buildings. We can see down in clause F that in class 9B buildings other than a school or early childhood center, so something that relates directly to us, the distance to one of the exits may be 60 meters if you conform with those three criteria or 3 requirements down there, F1, F2 and F3. Um, so what we have, if we have two exits, is really we have alternative exits. So you get to a point where you can actually choose alternative exits. So if we, the question then is that how far apart can these exits be, or how close can these exits be to each other? So you can see clause B over there, they can't be less than 9 meters apart. And you can see in clause C, C3, that in our 9B building, the distances between alternative exits can be 60 meters apart. So I think it bears, it probably deserves a demonstration. So let's have a look at an example here. What we see here is a plan of building 7, the part of building 7 that leads out to the concourse, that leads out to the northern end of the concourse, which is where the red line goes into. So if we look at the light blue line on the right of the drawing, what we can see is I've drawn the line from the furthest point from the door and to the door. So that that light blue line is 14 meters. Okay, so it conforms because it is under 20 meters. So at that point there, we then have two options. We have an option to take either the yellow line to go to the stair next to Gavork's office, or we can take the red line, which is to go to exit onto the concourse. So the red line from the door is 9 meters long, and it therefore conforms because it's under 20 meters. And the yellow is actually 48 meters from our room to the door to the stairwell near Gavork's office. So that doesn't really conform, and it's not surprising because not all buildings conform, and rules may have been different in the past, and also partition walls may have moved. So these kinds of things may have affected the actual travel distances themselves. The other way you could look at it is that the stair between the two toilets over there, between the ladies and the disabled to the right of the room, might also be considered an alternative exit, and in that case, that will then that could also be the alternative there. So the room with the light blue line works pretty well. If we look at the room with the blue line, that also is 14 meters from the corner of the room to the door, but then you can see the light green line there to the actual stair is 24 meters, which is over 20 meters, and clearly the alternative, which is to go out to the concourse, is going to be more than 20 meters as well. So that one actually doesn't conform for the reasons that I've just mentioned. Now, we have just spoken about the travel distances and which ascribe the travel pathways. So what this section 1.6, actually then tells us how wide those pathways need to be. Now this is related to how many people use a certain story of a building. You can see here that in clause D 1.6b1 that exits or path of travel to and exits, except for doorways, must be not less than 1 meter. And then a bit later on, we're going to have, or in clause C, you can see there that if you have more than 100 people but less than 200, then you have to add 250 millimeters in width for each 25% over that number. Okay, so 1 meter is clear, and this not only covers your corridors but also covers your stair widths. D actually allows for larger numbers of people again. So what we have to remember here is this is going to relate mostly to the back of house. This is going to relate to the back of house. in assignment 2 and not to the grandstand. Okay, not to the grandstand. What you will need then is the number of people who are actually going to use the back of house spaces. So what I've done is I have updated the assignment sheet so that you can see how many people that you need to design for, and then you can go back and comp that into the formulas that you see in this clause. Now, important to remember that these are minimum widths. In fact, the NCC, the code, the National Construction Code, and all the Australian standards are not optimum standards, but minimum standards. So we still need to design something that is going to be good to use and something that is going to feel generous and not feel constricted. Okay, so this is not an exercise about designing the minimums, but knowing what the minimums are, and then to design something which covers off the minimum but is also good to use. I point you to clause E on the top there, which says that in an open spectator stand which accommodates more than 2,000 people, the aggregate unobstructed width except for doorways must be increased to 17 meters. Now, I haven't found a requirement for closed spectator stands, but clearly 17 meters is far too much. And the fact that I haven't been able to find something for a closed spectator stand means that we'll have to look for a performance solution anyway. So I'll talk about the performance solution once we've gone through the parts of the NCC that I want to talk about. Now, we knew from the previous slide what our width of the exit pathways and stairs are. So what about the doors that go are in the way of this exit pathway? Well, if you look at clause F3 here, it says that the unobstructed width of each exit is to comply with B, C, D, or E above minus 250. So really, your doors only need to be 750 wide clear. Okay, so please go through this to figure out what they mean by clear. Moving right along, I just want to point you to one of the clauses over here, clause D111, which says that horizontal exits must not be counted as required exits between sole occupancy units or the early childhood center, which we're not looking at. So what that means is that you can't go through one room and use its closer location to an exit. You always have to use the door that feeds into the corridor when you're talking about required exits and therefore travel paths and so forth. Okay, now there is a whole part in the NCC about the number of persons that are to be accommodated in certain buildings and how you calculate that. So for the purposes of assignment 2, please refer to the updated assignment 2 brief, where you'll be able to add up the number of users in the back of house and then use that number for the purposes of assignment 2 and the NCC. A couple of things that do apply, but we won't look at in this assignment are goings and rises, so the dimensions of steps, as well as staircases. So for this assignment, I just want you to leave a space for staircases, a reasonable space for staircases, but I don't want you to actually design the staircases themselves. Designing the staircases and making the staircases conform to section D is something that I want you guys to do in assignment 3. Okay, so I'll go through it now while we're on section D, access and egress, but again, I don't want you to do it for this assignment. So a stairway must have not more than 18 and not less than 2 risers in each flight. The goings and the rises and the slope formula need to be in accordance with table D2.13, which is the next slide. So we can then see the other requirements there. Now, as I've mentioned in the tutorials, the aisles of our grandstand are going to be considered stepped aisles, not stairways, okay, not staircases. So while we do need to follow the maximum and minimums of rises and goings, we don't need to follow the number of rises. So if it's a stair, every 18 rises you need to have a landing. But in our case, in the grandstand, we won't be following that. And some of you might want to know how we get around that. This is where we actually go for a performance solution. Now, the dimension of exits and paths of exits, if we take the open spectator stand requirement of 17 meters, it just shows that this is not going to be possible. I consulted L. Baxter on this, and the way that Populous deal with it is that they have a specialist certifier that is familiar with performance solutions for stadia, and what they will do is that they will use the green guide as the basis for that performance solution. So for the purposes of this assignment, I'm not going to make you go through the green guide to actually find out what to do. I'm just going to actually tell you what you need to implement in assignment 2. So I've done this this performance solution in conjunction or in consultation with L. Baxter. The principle here is that they want grandstands to be empty in 8 minutes. So if you think about the photographs at the beginning of the lecture, what we need is every one of those seats, people in every one of those seats to be able to get out in 8 minutes to the park outside the MCG. Our performance solution to be used in this assignment is that for the entries, we will need 4 turnstiles and 1 private entrance of 1.2 meter wide, which will allow us to get our 2,500 people into the grandstand in a reasonable time. We are using a rate of people at 66 persons per meter per minute, which is a rate that is a good rate for fit young people as listed in the green guide. Ramps are to be a minimum of 1.2 meters wide and no more than 1 in 8, and this is also covered in the NCC. And stairs connecting the concourse and the entry should be a minimum of 1.2 meters wide and a maximum of 1.8 meters between handrails. So while there is a concern for minimum width, they are also concerned for very wide stairs that don't have intermittent handrails. So what this means is that if you have a stair that is 3.6 meters wide, then you will have to have a handrail on either side as well as one in the middle, because that will then limit the width between handrails to 1.8 meters. The concourse is to be 6 meters clear minimum width, so between the back of the last row of seats or wheelchair seats and the front of the food and beverage and merchandising stores, if you do have them there. And the aisles between the rows are to be a minimum of 1.2 meters in width. Continuing along here, we will follow the NCC clause H1.4c in terms of row clearways, but we will follow the green guide in terms of the maximum number of seats in a row. So when you have access to both ends, you can have up to 28 seats in a row, and if you only have access from one end, then you can only have 14 seats in a row. With the exit capacity, what we are going to use is a minimum aggregate width of 5 meters. What this means is all the widths of the exits added up together have to be at least 5, and they can certainly be more. For the purposes of assignment 2, please provide 4 exits minimum, evenly spread around the grandstand for draining or for exiting people. And so you can see that if we have 5 meters minimum width and 4 minimum exits, that means that each of those exits have to be 1.25 meters wide. Again, this is a minimum. If you can provide more, I'm happy for you to do so. But I want you to cite the performance solution or the NCC clause that you refer to in your design on your drawings in assignment 2. So there are going to be some exceptions to the grandstand performance solution according to the green guide. So in terms of steps and rises, we won't be using the green guide requirement, but we will use the NCC requirements, which we went through before. Let's use the maximum distance from any point in the grandstand to an exit of 60 meters, and this is something that L thought was a good distance was a generous distance for the kind of stadium that we are designing. And also the stairs, the stair dimensions are to conform to the NCC. Okay, so later in assignment 3, when you come to design your exit stairs, they will have to conform in terms of the riser and going dimensions, but also in terms of the number of risers before landing, and also the requirements for landings and so on and so forth. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up this lecture, but we are now in an interface student experience questionnaire week, so please help us to fill in the questionnaire this week before next Sunday. And as you know, as I've mentioned it before, I do use the information that I get from this, the comments that I get from this, as a way of improving the unit, even improving the unit as the semester is going. So I can be pretty responsive with these kinds of things. And as I've also mentioned before, this is actually something that is a key performance criteria or indicator for my job, meaning that you guys have an opportunity to help me fulfill my key performance indicators, and by extension to help me to keep my job. Now, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions about this lecture, please write them down and ask them in next week's tutorial, or else you can also drop me an email. So please let me know if you have any questions in the tutorial or before the tutorial, if you have something immediate and have something that's slowing down your progress in assignment 2.